6:17 a.m. The world shifts in a way that no headline captures. Cold light leaks across the edges of Eastern Europe, touching roads that are still wet from the night. Phones begin vibrating in kitchens, on windowsills, beside unmade beds. Notifications pile up before anyone has the chance to read the first one. And in that small, unsteady moment between the first alert and the next breath, a myth begins, quietly, without warning, like frost forming on glass. Outside, highways remain half empty, engines idle in the distance. The early morning has the texture of hesitation. A silence spreads across the region like a thin sheet of ice. No explosions, no alarms, just the unmistakable way of the world trying to interpret a signal it has not yet received. Rumors appear faster than sunlight. Screens glow, words distort, and in that silence, something irreversible begins. 7:03 a.m. The first myth rises from distance. The world looks toward Russia and sees a single shape, one voice, one will, one fixed identity. It is easier that way, easier to compress 17 time zones into a single thought. But inside that vast expanse, the truth moves differently. In Moscow, elevators hum back to life as morning commuters stand motionless under pale fluorescent light. In remote villages beyond the Urals, frost covers abandoned barns and radio antennas that crackle with uneven reception. In coastal cities, fishing boats drift quietly into gray water. The rhythm is uneven, fragmented, disjointed. The world imagines a monolith. Russia breathes in pieces, a mosaic held together not by unity, but by distance. And in that gap between perception and reality, a dangerous misunderstanding grows. 8 a.m. The second myth emerges, sharper, colder. The outside world believes Russia acts with flawless calculation, a machine turning gears in perfect coordination. But inside its borders, uncertainty stains everything like fog on a window pane. Footsteps echo in half-lit government buildings. Escalators and metro stations stutter before sliding into motion. A clerk adjusts a radio antenna as static, replaces the morning broadcast for a full 12 seconds. 12 seconds long enough for an entire nation to sense something is off. The myth of precision collapses under the weight of lived reality. History shows improvisation, abrupt decisions, internal conflict, moments when the state reacts not with strategy but with instinct. Nations far away imagine steady hands at a single control panel. But the truth is a patchwork of pressure points, conflicting interests, and decisions made in rooms where even the walls feel unsteady. 9:15 a.m. Another misconception spreads as the day grows brighter. The world believes Russia seeks constant global attention, that every move is a signal to the outside. Yet inside the country, the silence is overwhelming. Frosted windows in Siberia show no sign of the world beyond. In industrial towns, old factories remain locked in a permanent pause. Commuters pass each other without eye contact. Conversations shrink to whispers shaped more by survival than ambition. Most people inside these borders do not wake up seeking to shape the world. They wake up trying to endure it. The myth of ambition dissolves in the hum of a radiator struggling to stay warm. Attention is a foreign luxury here. The world watches Russia. Russia rarely watches back. 11:40 a.m. The fourth myth settles over the day like a low cloud. The belief that the Russian state and the Russian people move as one. It is a comfortable simplification for outsiders. A single silhouette projected onto a map. But inside the country, the divide is ancient, wide, and often silent. A government message appears on thousands of phones at once, written in the same tone as always. Firm, distant, absolute. Yet in apartments, in schools, in dark hallways that smell of dust and old paint, reactions scatter. Some dismiss it. Some fear it. Most simply absorb it with a quiet resignation of people accustomed to decisions made far above them. The state speaks loudly. The people speak quietly. Outsiders mistake volume for unity. 1 p.m. The day reaches its midpoint, but the tension does not ease. Crowds move through central squares, their steps synchronized only by necessity. Digital screens flicker with updates that feel more like shadows than information. A faint hum circulates through old power lines as if the infrastructure itself is straining to carry the weight of too many interpretations. Russia remains a puzzle the world insists it is already solved. But myths have hardened into belief, and belief has become a lens. And through that lens, the world sees only what fits the story it has already decided to tell. 6:42 p.m. Night approaches early across parts of the country. Lights flicker once, twice, in distant towns. No alarms follow. No announcements. Just the thin, eerie silence of a nation too large to fully illuminate. Rumors begin their slow climb through social networks, passing from one dim apartment to another. Each retelling adds a layer of uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the next myth begins forming, one that has the power to reshape how nations breathe, how leaders calculate, how fear spreads through the fragile threads of modern communication. The night settles. Screens dim. The world looks toward Russia again. And in the darkness, a deeper misunderstanding waits. Quiet, patient, and ready to define tomorrow. 6:30 p.m. Evening settles with the weight of unasked questions. Television anchors speak in measured tones, but the static beneath their voices betrays the uncertainty. Streetlights flicker on across European capitals, casting long shadows across pavements still wet from earlier rain. In living rooms, office lobbies, airport lounges, the same image repeats, a map of Russia glowing on screens, pulsing with speculation. Analysts fill silence with confidence. Commentators fill gaps with theory. And in the quiet between their words, the world drifts further from the truth. 7:10 p.m. The first myth of the night rises. The notion that Russia stands on the edge of collapse. Permanently, perpetually, inevitably. It resurfaces whenever tensions rise. It spreads through think tanks and hurried briefings. Yet inside Russia, the picture is muted, slower, more restrained. Grocery shelves are not full, but they are not bare. Trains arrive late, but they arrive. Factories wheeze forward, not efficiently, but persistently. Collapse is dramatic. Russia is rarely dramatic. Its reality is stagnation, long, grinding, shapeless. A system that bends under pressure, but does not break quickly enough for headlines to capture. The myth grows because the world expects sudden endings. Russia, instead, offers slow endurance. 8:47 p.m. The second myth emerges through the glow of diplomatic feeds. The belief that Russia acts alone, isolated, detached from global influence and support. It is a convenient narrative, a lone actor standing apart from a neatly arranged world order. But as midnight approaches, a different picture unfolds. Satellite messages pulse across borders. Energy pipelines hum beneath frozen soil. Deals are whispered in hotel corridors half a world away. Alliances here are not announced. They are implied. Quiet partnerships, subtle dependencies, old allegiances that operate beneath the radar. The myth survives because the truth moves too quietly. And in the darkened corners of geopolitics, silence often carries more weight than declarations. 10:12 p.m. A third misconception spreads as screens refresh. The assumption that Russia's military power is boundless, an endless reservoir of strength and capability. The world imagines steel columns moving with precision, aircraft rising in unbroken waves, a machine that never hesitates. But the reality, visible only when looked at closely, is far more fragile. Old bases sit under layers of frost. Equipment rusts in forgotten storage yards. Logistics strain across impossible distances. A nation this vast cannot project force without bearing the scars of its own geography. And the soldiers sleeping in unheated barracks are not the myth the world wants to believe in. Power from afar looks absolute. Up close, it looks scattered. 11:58 p.m. The fourth myth drifts into the late-night hours. The idea that Russia can be predicted, that its next move, next shift, next crisis follows rules the world already understands. But unpredictability is woven into Russia's history. Empires rise in a generation and fall in a week. Leadership changes with the suddenness of winter storms. Revolutions ignite from whispered conversations in cramped rooms. 3:11 a.m. Snow begins to fall across the Volga region. Roads empty. Gas stations glow like distant beacons in the dark. Somewhere, a generator coughs as the power grid stutters. Emergency broadcasts interrupt nighttime radio, their voices sharp against the quiet. The map feels stable only until you listen closely. Beneath its surface, fault lines shift with no warning. The myth that Russia follows a script endures because the world needs certainty. But certainty is the one thing Russia never offers. 4:20 a.m., the air grows colder. Newsrooms on the other side of the world keep their lights on through the night. Analysts argue under bright studio lamps, pointing at graphics that simplify a nation too vast to summarize. Confidence sells. Doubt does not. And so myths tighten their grip. In Russia, dawn approaches. The snow thickens. The landscape grows pale and muted, as if holding its breath before morning. 5:03 a.m. A faint hum rises as cities slowly reawaken. Screens flicker back to life. But in one region, a stretch of industrial land by the rail lines, darkness remains. No signal. No updates. Only silence. The silence is not dangerous because it hides something. It is dangerous because the world fills it with assumptions. Through this silence, through this carefully constructed uncertainty, the final and most powerful myth begins to form. Quietly, invisibly, like a storm building beyond the horizon. A myth not about Russia's strength or weakness, but about what the world believes Russia will do next. And when the screens freeze at 5:47 a.m., the silence deepens. It spreads across borders, crackles through radios, and settles into the early morning air. In that silence, something fragile fractures. A misinterpretation sharpens. And the world forgets the final myth, the one that matters most, the one that will decide how tomorrow unfolds. For a.m., darkness holds a landscape in a silent grip. Entire regions sit without movement, without signal, without the familiar hum of a sleepless world. Power lines tremble in the cold, their vibrations fading into the empty sky. A lone street lamp flickers, then settles into a dim, uncertain glow. No aircraft cross the horizon. No trains echo across the plains. This is the hour when myths breathe most easily. The hour when the world, half awake and uneasy, projects its fears onto a vast, quiet map. And it is here, in this fragile pre-dawn stillness, that the final myth begins to form. For 17 a.m., a soft wind moves across frozen farmland near the Urals. Snow lifts in thin sheets, drifting like memory. The narrator's voice settles low, steady, untouched by the urgency that vibrates through the rest of the world. This is where the last myth begins. Not in Moscow, not in a war room, but in the silence between expectations. Because the world believes something about Russia, something enormous, something unquestioned, something that shapes every political calculation. It believes Russia is inevitable. 5:02 a.m. The myth of inevitability stretches back centuries. Empires, revolutions, collapse, resurrection. The world assumes the cycle will continue forever, that Russia will always return, always reassemble, always remain a defining force in the global order. But as snow buries abandoned factories and fresh markets open near new tech districts, the truth is more fragile than the myth. Nothing in Russia is permanent. Not borders, not leaders, not ideologies, not identities. The nation is less an immovable object and more a shifting landscape, rising, falling, reforming under the weight of history's invisible pressure. The world calls it stability, but inside the borders, people call it change. 6:14 a.m. Power returns in one district of a major city. Lights warm pale apartment walls. Neighbors stand silently in hallways, listening for familiar buzz of restored electricity. 2 miles away, another district remains in darkness. A single substation failed, and no one knows why. This uneven illumination becomes a symbol, a reminder that Russia does not move in unity, does not break in unison, does not evolve at a predictable pace. The myth insists on inevitability. Reality whispers instability. 6:48 a.m. Another myth stirs as morning nears. The belief that Russia determines the world's fate alone. For generations, political narratives elevated Russia to a singular force, a nation capable of shaping global destiny with one decision, one gesture, one misstep. But the world today is more crowded, more interconnected, more fragile. Decisions in Northern Europe ripple through Asia, Energy pulses across continents in silent pipelines. Economies wobble from meetings in rooms with no windows. No single nation controls the wheel, yet the myth persists. It persists because uncertainty is terrifying, and placing responsibility on one vast silhouette makes fear easier to manage. But the truth is cold and heavy. Russia does not steer the future alone. It simply shares the wheel with too many other, equally unsteady hands. 7:42 a.m. Fog rolls across the Volga region like a slow-moving tide. Traffic lights blink into existence one by one, casting red reflections onto wet asphalt. Factories warn their engines. Ships creak along icy rivers. And in the background, radio hosts speak cautiously, each word delivered as though it might fracture the air. This is the moment when the most stubborn myth rises. The myth that Russia cannot be understood, that its motives, tensions, decisions, and contradictions are too complex, too alien, too distant for the world to interpret correctly. But the truth is simpler. Russia is not unknowable. It is merely uncomfortable. A place shaped by vastness, by scarcity, by cycles of pressure and release. A place where silence often explains more than speeches. Where geography dictates behavior as much as ideology. Where history repeats not because people forget, but because the landscape demands the same answers again and again. Understanding Russia requires looking past fear, and the world rarely looks without trembling. 8:21 a.m. A low mechanical hum begins in the distance. Factories returning to life. Snow melts from rooftops as weak sunlight pushes through the fog, and yet across several regions, the power grid flickers again. A momentary darkness swallows the skyline before stabilizing. Rumors rise. Social networks ignite. Foreign intelligence agencies release cautious statements. Every flicker becomes another theory. Every blackout becomes another headline. Every moment of silence becomes another reason to lean on myths instead of truth. The world sees these signals and fills them with fear. But inside Russia, the pattern is familiar, intermittent, imperfect, normal. The myth grows not because Russia hides itself, but because the world refuses to see the ordinary. 9:10 a.m. The sun lifts fully above the horizon, pale and distant. Cities stir under its muted light, but unease lingers. Something about the morning feels unfinished, like a sentence missing its final word. As markets open in Europe, the world watches Russia with the expectation that a decisive move will come, something dramatic, something inevitable, something that would define the next chapter of global history. But nothing dramatic arrives. Only the slow, uneven breath of a nation too large for simple interpretation. The narrator's voice softens. The myths do not protect us. They blind us. And in that blinding, nations miscalculate the world's most dangerous relationship. 9:47 a.m. Traffic moves through Moscow. Snow melts on rural highways. Factories hum. Phones buzz. Life continues, not as a monolith, not as a machine, not as an eternal empire, but as a vast, contradictory landscape that defies the world's imagination. The biggest myth of all is not about Russia's strength or weakness. It is a belief that myths themselves are harmless. They are not. They shape diplomacy. They ignite fears. They mislead leaders. They steer nations toward miscalculation. 10:02 a.m. The world will continue to draw lines across maps, to predict, to assume, to fear, to simplify what was never simple. But the truth stands quietly beneath the noise. Understanding Russia does not guarantee stability. Misunderstanding it guarantees instability. And as the final images fade, flickering city lights, empty highways, static-filled radios, the narrator leaves one last, steady line in the silence. Understanding Russia does not prevent the next crisis. Misunderstanding it guarantees one.